Hello everybody. The term stagflation is very much in news these days. Apprehensions are there that the world economy is falling into stagflation. If it happens so, its consequences would be dire for the entire world. In this context, today we will discuss the concept of stagflation, its causes, consequences, and what is the risk of stagflation to Indian economy. So let us start discussing today's topic. Why to discuss? Means, is stagflation so threatening that we are considering important to discuss the concept of stagflation here? Yes, of course. The world is slipping into stagflation with consequences harmful to middle and low income countries. As I have already told that the world is passing into stagflation, and if it turns into reality, its consequences would be bad for the entire world, but worse for the middle income and low income countries. This is what the World Bank's latest Global Economic Prospects report says. Very recently, in the month of June 2022, the World Bank has published a report named Global Economic Prospects. And in that report, also, the World Bank has expressed the concern of falling the world economy into stagflation. The World Bank report offers comparing the current global economic conditions with the stagflation of 1970s, a systematic assessment of how stagflation could affect emerging markets and developing economies. So last time the world experienced stagflation was in 1970s. So the World Bank in its report has mentioned that stagflation of 1970s, and in the report there is a comparison of the present situation, present conditions with those of the conditions in 1970s. And apart from that, the World Bank has provided a systematic assessment of how stagflation would be harmful for the emerging markets and developing economies. So why we are focusing more on emerging markets, developing economies, middle income countries, low income countries? This is because these are the most vulnerable to such an economic condition. What is stagflation? So stagflation is a combination of two words, that is stagnation plus inflation. Inflation. So by taking the first four letters of stagnation and the last seven letters of the word inflation, a new term, that is a stagflation, has been coined. Stagflation has been coined. So stagflation is an economic condition where there is stagnation of economic activity, means economy is not progressing forward, and inflation means a very high rate of commodities, means goods and services. Okay. So stagflation is an economic condition where a high rate of inflation is accompanied by stagnant economic growth. On one side, there is the stagnant economic growth, and on the other side, there is high rate of inflation, means the price level is high. When such an economic condition occurs, then it is known as stagflation, because the common perception is that when there will be higher rate of inflation, there will be more investment, because the producers would be motivated. There would be, you can say, bullish trend in the market. So that is why the economic growth may accelerate with the rise in the prices. But no, this is also a particular condition which the world experienced in 1970s, that it is not necessary that with rise in prices, there will always be economic prosperity, or there will always be more investment, more economic growth, more production, more output, more employment. So this does not happen always. So therefore, stagflation is characterized by a high inflation rate, slow or no economic growth. Both these points we have already discussed. The lack of economic growth over time would lead to a higher rate of unemployment. So see, if there is a stagnation, means there is either low economic growth or no economic growth, then obviously it would lead to higher level of unemployment. So that is why, according to some economists, there are three characteristics of stagflation. One is high inflation rate, second is slow or no economic growth, and third is high rate of unemployment. So stagflation is a symptom of malfunctioning of an economy. So stagflation indicates that all is not well in the economy. There is something wrong in the economy. So it is a symptom of a malfunctioning of the economy. So the term was coined in 1965 by Ian MacLeod, a British politician. So a British politician named Ian MacLeod coined the term of stagflation in 1965. So about the stagflation of 1970s, means what were the main reasons of the stagflation in 1970? Okay. So last time the world experienced stagflation in 1970s from 1973 onwards. Okay. So as we have already discussed that stagflation has two important characteristics. One is higher level of prices, and second is lower economic growth. So this is there. Stagnation in economic activity, we can say it like that also. Okay. So now we will have to see in the history of that time that what were the factors that led to the higher prices and low economic growth. So one factor was balance of payments pressure on the US economy, which compelled it to take off the gold standard of currency and let the value of the dollar float. So because the value of US dollar was fixed against the dollar, but the other economies of the world were taking advantage of that. They were devaluing their currencies against the dollar, and that is why their exports were higher as compared to exports of US. So therefore, there was balance of payments pressure on the US economy, and reacting on that, the US president of that time decided to took off or withdraw from the gold standard and let and allowed the value of dollar to float. So what happened? So this led to subsequent fall of the dollar. So how? Because other countries were uh, taking the advantage of the higher value of dollar, and they were devaluing their currencies against dollar, and that is why their exports were higher than those of the US, and therefore because of the less export of the US, the dollar demand was lesser in the market, so therefore the value of dollar fell, and it added to the inflationary pressure in the US. So with the fall in the value of domestic currency, or with the fall in exchange value of domestic currency, or in real value of domestic currency, what happens? Imports become dearer. Imports become dearer. So if the imports become dearer, then obviously the cost of production, cost of manufacturing would increase, and with increase in the cost of production or cost of manufacturing, so there would be inflationary pressure. So because US was in better position, so it was mainly importing raw materials from the various countries of the world and processing that raw material into the finished goods and selling it into the world market. So when the value of dollar fell, so it led to the uh, costlier import of raw materials, which led to increase in the cost of manufacturing, cost of production, and that is why the inflationary pressure on the US economy uh, deepened further. And a high inflation rate was fueled further by the oil embargo placed on the US by ARB members of OPEC. OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Actually, there was Arab-Israeli war in that period because US was supporting Israel. Even today, US is supporting Israel. And in that context, the Arab countries put an oil embargo, means sanctions against US, that they would not supply oil to the US. Okay, so that was there. So due to that oil embargo on the US by the Arab countries, on the US and on the countries that were supporting US at that time, so oil embargo was put on all those economies, and that is why the prices of the fuel increased, and it further led to the higher rate of inflation in the US economy and in the world economy as a consequence. The US businesses cut back on production, which made goods scarcer and increased unemployment. So, what happened as a consequence of the oil embargo? Because the prices were rising and it was unaffordable for the US businesses to bear such a higher burden in terms of the prices. So therefore, they preferred to uh, cut down their production. With the fall in production, what happened? So number one, economic growth slowed down. Economic growth in America slowed down. So one effect was that, and the second effect was that it led to higher unemployment. Unemployment. So this led to the condition of stagflation in 1970s. Uh, the causes in present. So what are the various causes in present? So one cause is strong consumer demand after pandemic lockdowns. So it means higher pent up demand. Higher pent up demand. So what we mean by the pent up demand? Pent up demand means the demand which was uh, or the demand which the consumers were holding during the pandemic period, and after the pandemic was over, or the effect of the pandemic was falling, so they started uh, consuming those goods which were already the consumption of which was already postponed by the consumers. So that means many goods like particularly the beauty products. So during the pandemic, the demand of these products fell down, Similarly, hospitality sector, because tourism was worstly affected, hospitality sector, etc. So there were many. Similarly, clothing, we can say clothing, jewelry, etc., etc. So the demand of all these things was postponed by the consumers during the pandemic period. Okay. So after the pandemic in 2021 or so, uh, the demand for such products started increasing, and which is called the pent up demand. So with the end of the pandemic, or with the fading away of the effect of pandemic, you can say, the demand of those commodities which was already put on hold by the consumers, that started rising, and this led to higher consumer demand. Disrupted supply chains. So disruption in supply chains was caused by pandemic, and now there is disruption in supply chains due to Ukraine conflict. Energy shortfalls late in the year 2021. By the end of the year 2021, in November, December of 2021, there was shortage of coal and other energy products. So that is why the prices rose further. Higher unemployment rate in many parts of the world. It is important to note here that in many parts of the world, or in many countries of the world, the rate of unemployment is higher than 25%. In some countries it is higher than 50%, and in some countries like Burkina Faso, it is higher than 70% unemployment rate. But during the pandemic also, the employment rate fell down, and the rate of unemployment increased further. So all the G7 economies were also affected during the pandemic time. So that is why the unemployment rate increased due to the pandemic in the world. Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this led to economic crisis, disruption of the supply chains, fall in the supply of fertilizers, fuel like gas, oil, and edible oil, wheat, etc., and some minerals also. Sanctions against Russia, which led to price surges in food, natural gas, fertilizers, and minerals. Due to the sanctions against Russia by the Western world, including the US, means led by the US. So, uh, the supply of food articles, natural gas, fertilizers, minerals got affected, and that led to the increase in prices all over the world. Hike in interest rate by US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the central banks of various other countries, including that of India, to counter the inflationary situation. So far, we have reached the conclusion that due to the pandemic and disruption of supply chains, higher pent-up demand, and Ukraine conflict, sanctions against Russia, due to all these things, all these factors, you can say the prices in the world rose. It means the inflationary trend started, and to counter that inflationary trend, the central banks of various countries, like the Federal Reserve of the US, Bank of England, and banks of other countries like the Reserve Bank of India also, they increased their policy rates, means interest rates. So the effect of increase in the policy rates or rates of interest was, number one, investment. It led to lowering the level of investments, because whenever the rate of interest increases, the borrowers become discouraged, and that uh, leads to the fall in the investment. So fall in investment means a slow economic activity. And second is in increase in the prices due to uh, increase in the interest rate. So otherwise also when there is hike in the interest rate or hike in the policy rate, it is an indication that there is inflationary trend. So that means on the one side inflation and on the other side fall in investment due to increase in the that is uh, the interest rates or policy rates. Okay. And with the increase in the policy rates by the developed countries like US, we can say, so it led to the capital flight from developing countries or emerging countries like India, capital flights and low inflow of capital. So capital flight increased and low inflow of capital. So inflow of capital decreased. So low inflow of capital there. So this was there, and it led to the depreciation of domestic currencies of developing economies like that of Indian rupee, depreciation of domestic currencies of uh, developing countries like that of Indian rupee. So it further led to the you can say inflation. So this is the situation. Slow economic activity caused by higher interest rates. So this led to fall in the economic activity and the rate of interest rose further, and that is why uh, you can say the conditions are very much conducive for stagflation to occur. So this is there. So effects of stagflation. Increase in Misery Index. So Misery Index means it is a combination of two. One is the inflation, and on the other hand, the unemployment rate. Okay? So when inflation is accompanied by high rate of unemployment, it leads to the or it adds to the misery of the common individuals in a country. So that is why the misery index rose with this, with stagflation, it rises, and social unrest, because when there is a rise in prices, on the one hand there is a price rise, on the other hand there is scarcity, it causes scarcity also, and next there is a loss of employment due to the uh, stagnant economic activity or low economic activity, loss of employment. And loss of employment leads to the loss of income. Loss of income means a low level of living. So when all this happens, then it is quite obvious that it would lead to social unrest, as we are seeing it in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka as on today. So political instability. So when there is the economic uncertainty, when there is economic crisis, so it definitely affects the government, because people, you can say, start uh, considering the government at fault, which is not giving attention to revive the economy. So this leads to the political instability, as well as we are seeing the case of Sri Lanka. A real long time risk to emerging and developing economies. So how risk to emerging and developing economies? So as I have already told, with increase in the policy rates by the US Federal Reserve. So if we take the example of Indian economy, because it is also a developing economy, So what will be the consequences of increase of policy rates by the US Federal Reserve? So one is what that is the uh, that is the currency depreciation, means depreciation of Indian rupee. So this is the one impact. So why this depreciation of Indian rupee? So I'm just explaining because there is a capital flight from India. Capital flight from India because lakhs of crores of capital has been withdrawn by the foreign institutional investors, foreign portfolio investors in the wake of the rise in interest rate by the US Federal Reserve, which is 125 points in just a span of approximately 2 months. So, more capital flight from the country. So, one is that, and one is there that is a you can say capital inflow in the country reduced. A reduction in inflow of capital in the country. Capital inflow reduced. So the effect of this and the next is that increase in the rate of interest of external commercial borrowings in this case. Why? Because now it would be costlier for the Indian corporates to borrow from the international market because the preference of the investors today or those who are having money today is to invest their money into the US economy instead of investing it into the Indian economy. So that is why the Indian corporates would have to bear higher rate of interest if they want to borrow from the international market. And similarly, the government would also have to increase the rate of interest on the bonds. So these are the some important consequences. So what will happen with this? So and one thing is that with the lack of capital, with capital flight from the country, with fall in the capital inflows in the medium term or in the long term, what will be the consequences? There will be fall in production also. There will be fall in production leading to the scarcity of goods in the economy. So due to all this, okay, so number one, uh, there is higher demand for dollars because the foreign institutional investors or foreign portfolio investors who have invested money in Indian market, they would now uh, like to convert their investment into dollars and to withdraw it from the Indian market to shift it to the US economy. So that is why there will be higher dollar demand. And similarly, uh, fall in capital inflow. So due to the capital inflow, the supply of dollars in India would fall. So it means more dollars are being demanded in comparison with the rupee. So therefore, it would lead to increase in the dollar price. Okay, so dollar would become dearer and the exchange value of Indian rupee in comparison with dollar would fall. So this is known as the depreciation of Indian rupee in this week. So now what is there? So one effect is this that capital flight and that fall in capital inflow and rise in the external commercial borrowings as far as the corporates of these emerging and developing economies are concerned. And another effect would be because the emerging and developing countries mainly export raw materials to the developed world. Okay? export raw materials to the developed world, and they export they import technology and finished goods from the developed world. Okay. So this is the common, you can say, point here. This is the common point. So now, if due to the situation like stagflation, the economies of the developed countries would be affected. So as a consequence, what would happen? You can say the demand for raw material from the emerging markets and developing markets by the developed world would fall, would fall. So with that fall in demand of raw material by the developed world from the emerging and developing economies, so it will hurt the economies of the developing countries, or it will hurt the economies of the emerging countries. Okay? So this is how the stagflation would affect more to the emerging and developing economies in the long time, as it has been mentioned. So next is who is at most risk? Even if a global recession is averted, the pain of stagflation could persist for several years unless major supply increases are set in motion. This has been said by the World Bank President, Mr. David Malpass. So, Mr. David Malpass of the World Bank, who is the president of the World Bank, has said that if we try our best to avert the global recession and we become successful in averting the global recession, even then the pain of stagflation would be experienced by the countries in the coming few years unless the major supply increases are set in motion, because at present the supply chains have been disrupted due to the pandemic and due to the Ukraine conflict. So in that context, the president of the World Bank has said that if we become successful in averting the global recession, even then the pain of stagflation would be felt by the countries in the years to come. So next is who is at most risk? The European Union and the UK are at higher risk of stagflation than the US. So why this? This is because economic recovery from the pandemic had been stronger in European Union and UK than in the US. So higher economic recovery means there is higher economic demand. So more demand. So if there is more demand, there would be increase in prices, higher rate of inflation. So that is why it is said that the European Union and the UK are at higher risk of stagflation than the United States. Inflation in Eurozone hit 8.1% in May 2022. Though, as we have discussed in some previous lecture, that the rate of inflation in US economy was also higher in the last 40 years. In the month of April 2022, that was 8.6% approximately. So but the rate of inflation in Eurozone and in UK is also high. The OECD predicted that the UK would be the slowest growing member of G7 countries in 2023. Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has predicted that among the G7 countries, the UK would be the slowest growing economy in the year 2023. So that means there is higher demand in UK, rising prices in UK, accompanied by the slow economic growth. So the situation is very much conducive or akin to the conditions which are required for the stagflation. The heat of the fire of stagflation in the developed world would be more experienced in the developing world, which we have already discussed adequately. So the next is India at risk of stagflation? First of all, we will have a look at the statistics. So one is CAD, means current account deficit, which is near 3% of that is gross domestic product, is very high, and it is expected to deteriorate further. So this is not a good sign. Though India is expected to remain one of the fastest growing economies of the world in 2022 and 23, India's growth forecasts have been lowered by various analysts. Though it is said that India is going to remain one of the fastest growing economies of the world in the year 2022 and 23, but still the various agencies, including the International Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, and other agencies, even the private agencies, have also lowered the growth forecasters of India. Though India's economic growth is still would be still sufficient, but yes, the growth forecasters have been lowered by various agencies. CPI based inflation, Consumer Price Index based inflation rate, which touched 7.79% in April 2022 and 7.04% in May 2022. This is very high rate of inflation, which is much higher than the official inflation target of 4%. Rate hike by Reserve Bank of India of 40 basis points in May 2022 and 50 basis points in June 2022, and it is expected that Reserve Bank of India would increase repo rate in the days to come also. So that means with the hike of the repo rate by the Reserve Bank of India, the rate of interest is increasing. So that means the demand would fall. If the demand falls and rate of interest increases, obviously it would affect the investment in the country, it would affect the manufacturing in the country, it may lead to the increase in the unemployment in the country, and the prices are already very high. So depreciating Indian rupee in the wake of a rate hike in the US. So with the depreciation of Indian rupee, the import bill of India would increase, imports become dearer, and India is mainly an importing nation. So that is why it would lead to a further increase in prices in the country. So which is not a good sign. So unemployment rate 7.8% in April 2022, which is again on the higher side. So next is the risk of inflation in India is lower than that in other countries. This has been said by India's Chief Economic Advisor V. Anantha Nageswaran. So V. Anantha Nageswaran is India's Chief Economic Advisor, and he has said that the risk of inflation of India would be lower as compared to the risk of inflation to the other countries. So on what grounds our Chief Economic Advisor has said this? So let us have a look at that. One point is more scope for growth in India than in developed countries because their growth prospects get saturated. So India is an emerging economy. Okay, so investment bounces back more in Indian economy as compared with the developed world because they have already achieved the saturation or they are near saturation. So that is why the growth prospects in developed countries are less as compared with the Indian economy. India has ensured adequate availability of food grains and fertilizers. Okay, so there is a adequate availability of food grains and fertilizers in our country. So that is why in the days to come, the risk to the economy in this respect is also less. Increasing GST collection, which is all-time high at 1.68 lakh crore in April 2022, indicated that the economy is accelerating on the right track. So in the month of April 2022, the collection from the GST was all-time high in the Indian economy. So this is an indication that Indian economy is accelerating now and it is at the right track. To avoid inflation fueled further by surge in oil prices, India has started buying crude oil at discounted prices from Russia. This is also an important point because as we have said that in stagflation there are two factors. One is inflation and means rise in prices, and the other factor is the economic growth. So fall in economic growth. So these are the two factors. Okay. So to counter the inflation, the government of India has started buying crude oil at discounted prices from Russia. So that will help the Indian economy in two ways. Number one, it would lead to control the rise in prices in the Indian economy, and number two, with the you can say fall in the fuel prices, so economic activity may pick up in our country. So this is an important decision taken by the government of India in this respect, and moreover, the government of India has taken some other measures also to calm the inflationary concern. One is the cut in excise duty on petrol and diesel, and hike in repo rate. And third important is that export restrictions as far as the wheat and sugar are concerned. Export restrictions in case of wheat and sugar. So these are the various wise decisions taken by the government of India in this respect in the present scenario. So according to the monthly state of economy report released in June 2022 by the Reserve Bank of India, India is better placed to avoid the risk of stagflation. Even the Reserve Bank of India, which has published its monthly report in the month of June 2022, that is State of Economy report, it has also mentioned that India is better placed to avoid the risk of stagflation. That means the risk of stagflation is not that much in India as it is in other economies of the world. This is due to the following. Number one, most of GDP constituents exceeding their pre-pandemic levels. So according to this, that many constituents of GDP are better than the pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so even according to the economic survey of the year 2021-22, which was presented on or which was released on January 31st of 2022, there are some positive signs. What are the positive signs? One positive sign is that government's supply side reforms you can say have led are going to lead to the long-term expansion of the Indian economy. Second, growth in capital expenditure. Third, foreign exchange reserves are sufficiently higher in India. The next is macroeconomic stability indicators also suggest that Indian economy is well equipped to face the challenges in 2022-23, and there is massive growth in revenue receipts of India, and moreover the expenditure on social services as proportion of GDP has increased in India. So considering all these points and all these factors, we can say that you can say the Indian economy is better placed as far as the risk from the stagflation is concerned. So despite multiple shocks, India strives to regain a sustainable high growth trajectory. Though Indian economy has received many setbacks in the past, but still the economy of India has been able to, you can say, return on the growth trajectory again. So tightening of monetary and liquidity conditions by increasing the repo rate by 90 basis points in less than 2 months. So Government of India means, or we can say the Monetary Policy Committee, Reserve Bank of India is very much concerned with the price rise in India, and showing their concern towards that, in just a week, in just a period of 2 months only, the repo rate has been increased by 90 basis points in India. So now, so that means considering all these things, we can say that India is a India is better placed as far as the risk-prone stagflation is concerned in comparison with the other countries. Okay, so there is a less risk of stagflation to Indian economy uh, in comparison with the other countries. So some suggestions. First suggestion is, suggestions means what the governments can do in such a scenario to avoid from the stagflation. So one is encourage production. So it is important. So if the production would be increased, it would lead to increase in the production, the increase in production will lead to increase in the economic activity, and that would lead to increase in the, you can say that, employment level, fall in the unemployment, and moreover with increase in the production, the supply of the goods would increase, and it can have a calming effect on the rising level of prices also. Avoid trade restrictions. So the countries should avoid the trade restrictions in this scenario, because the entire world, you can say, in respect of the global scenario, we can say that entire world is interconnected. So the economic decision taken by one country affects various other economies. So that is why trade restrictions should be avoided by the governments in such a scenario. Changes in fiscal, monetary, climate, and debt policy to counter capital misallocations and the inequality. So the governments need to recalibrate their policies, fiscal policy, monetary policy, debt policy, climate policy, etc., etc., so that the capital resources could be optimally utilized, and the uh, disadvantaged sections of the societies, means disadvantaged people, could be helped in a better way. Policymakers are advised to refrain from distortionary policies such as price controls, subsidies, export bans, which could worsen the recent increase in commodity prices. So, to check the commodity prices and to avoid the stagflationary situation, it is advised that the country should refrain from the distortionary policies like price controls and subsidies. Okay, so that means check on subsidies like that. Okay, export bans should be avoided in such a scenario. So this is there, and governments need to reprioritize spending toward targeted relief for vulnerable populations. So governments should show more concern towards the vulnerable population, because they are the worst sufferer in such an economic condition. So this is important point here to be discussed. Okay, so this is there. So government should exercise price controls. So government should not withdraw the subsidies in the current scenario, because that would lead to, you can say, higher demand or that would lead to increase in investment. So on the one side we can say that, but on the other side, yes, the governments should curb the subsidies also, because more subsidies means more demand. Okay, so if the demand is higher, then there would be the inflationary pressure on the economies, and the inflationary pressure, if it is there, okay, so that is difficult to tackle, and that may lead to the stagflation. So that is why the government should, you can say, stay away from the subsidies in the current scenario. Okay, so this is there. So this was the today's topic, or lecture, today's lecture on stagflation. So in today's lecture, we have discussed that why to discuss stagflation, what is stagflation, what are its causes, what are its consequences, and what is the risk to Indian economy from stagflation, and what are the suggested solution. I hope the entire concept would be clear to you. If anybody still has any doubt or any question in mind, you can kindly write that in comment box. I will definitely address your query. So all the best for today. It is enough for today. Thank you very much. Stay blessed, stay happy. God bless you all. I will meet you soon in the with the next lecture.